This 1902 photo shows a mother holding her newborn, but historians notice something wrong with her smile. The morning light crept slowly through the tall windows of the Hartwell Restoration Studio in Boston, casting golden rectangles across workbenches cluttered with the fragments of forgotten lives. Dust particles floated lazily in the beams, dancing above stacks of damaged photographs, waiting to be brought back from the edge of oblivion. The radiator in the corner hissed softly, fighting against the February chill that pressed against the old brick building. Eleanor Mitchell pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she settled into her chair, the familiar creak of old leather greeting her like an old friend. At 53, Eleanor had spent nearly 3 decades restoring photographs, bringing clarity to faded faces and repairing the ravages of time, water, fire, and simple neglect. Her studio occupied the 3rd floor of a converted textile mill in South Boston, a space she had chosen specifically for its northern light and its quiet isolation from the noise of the city below. The box that sat on her workbench that morning had arrived the previous afternoon, shipped from an estate sale in Worcester. Eleanor had not opened it yet. She preferred to greet new projects in the morning light, when her eyes were fresh and her mind was clear. Most of what came to her was unremarkable. Water-stained wedding portraits, sun-faded family groupings, cracked cabinet cards of stern-faced ancestors. She would repair them, return them, and never think of them again. But then she lifted the lid of the cardboard box and felt something shift in the air around her. Nestled in tissue paper, protected by cardboard corners, was a single photograph in an ornate brass frame. The frame itself was tarnished nearly black in places, the decorative scrollwork along the edges caked with decades of accumulated grime. But it was the image beneath the clouded glass that made Eleanor pause, her fingers hovering above the surface. The photograph showed a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, seated in a high-backed chair. She wore a white cotton gown with delicate lace at the collar, her dark hair pulled back simply from her face. In her arms, she cradled a newborn infant wrapped tightly in a pale blanket. The baby's eyes were closed, its tiny face peaceful in sleep. The composition was typical of maternal portraits from the turn of the century, the kind of image that families treasured for generations. But it was the mother's smile that drew Eleanor's attention. The woman was smiling, as mothers in such photographs invariably did. But there was something wrong with that smile. Eleanor had studied thousands of faces across her career, had learned to read the subtle language of expression that survived even in faded silver gelatin prints. She knew the difference between genuine joy and performed happiness, between natural ease and rigid discomfort. This smile was neither, it was something else entirely. Eleanor retrieved her magnifying loupe from the drawer and leaned closer, her trained eye moving methodically across the woman's face. The smile was asymmetrical in a way that seemed involuntary rather than stylistic. The left side of her mouth curved upward naturally, but the right side seemed to strain, as if the muscles there were fighting against some invisible resistance. There was a tightness around her eyes that contradicted the upward curve of her lips, and her complexion, even accounting for the sepia tones and the aging of the photograph, appeared mottled, uneven. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had seen enough Victorian and Edwardian photographs to recognize the signs of illness captured inadvertently by the camera's unforgiving eye. But this was different. The woman's knuckles, visible where she gripped the baby, were white with tension. A thin sheen seemed to cover her forehead, visible even through the aged emulsion. And in her eyes, behind the forced smile, Eleanor saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. She saw someone who knew she was dying. Eleanor sat back slowly, her mind racing. The photograph seemed designed to capture a moment of joy, a new mother with her precious child. Yet the woman's smile told a story of anguish that contradicted everything the image was meant to represent. The next morning, Eleanor found herself climbing the worn marble steps of the Massachusetts State Archives, the photograph carefully protected in her leather portfolio. She had spent a restless night researching, trying to identify the photography studio from the faded imprint on the back of the cardboard mount. Were barely legible, but they gave her a starting point. The archives occupied a grand building near the State House, its interior hushed and reverent like a cathedral dedicated to the preservation of memory. Eleanor approached the main desk where a man in his 60s sat surrounded by request forms and catalog cards. "I'm hoping you can help me trace a photograph," Eleanor said, sliding the image across the counter. Harold adjusted his glasses and examined the image carefully. His expression shifted subtly as he studied the mother's face. "Unusual portrait," he murmured. "That's why I'm here." Harold nodded slowly. Morrison and Sons closed in 1918, but we have some of their business records, customer ledgers, appointment books. He disappeared into the stacks, and Eleanor waited in the reading room, surrounded by researchers bent over microfilm machines and document boxes. Nearly an hour passed before Harold returned, carrying a worn leather ledger. "I found their appointment book for 1901 through 1903, he said, setting it carefully on the reading table. Eleanor turned the fragile pages carefully, scanning entries written in faded ink. Names, dates, types of photographs, and occasionally brief notes about the subjects. February 1902, March 1902, April, and then, on a page dated April 17, 1902, she found an entry that made her heart skip. O'Brien, Margaret, mother and infant portrait. Urgent request, subject very ill. The words fee waived and subject very ill were underlined twice. Eleanor stared at the entry, feeling the weight of those simple words. The photographer had known. He had recorded it for posterity, this woman's illness, this urgent desire to have her photograph taken with her child. But the ledger offered no other information, no address, no details about what illness plagued Margaret O'Brien or what became of her and her baby. "I'm afraid that's all we have from Morrison and Sons," Harold said apologetically. Their detailed customer records were lost in a fire in 1920. He wrote a name on a slip of paper. Dr. Sarah Whitmore at Harvard Medical School. She specializes in medical history, particularly maternal and infant mortality in the early 20th century. Eleanor took the paper, feeling the first threads of a larger story beginning to weave together. Dr. Sarah Whitmore's office was located in a quiet corner of the Harvard Medical School campus, tucked away in a building that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books, journals, and filing cabinets, every surface covered with papers, photographs, and medical instruments from another era. A human skeleton stood in one corner wearing a top hat that someone had placed there as a joke years ago. Dr. Whitmore herself was a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She examined Eleanor's photograph for nearly 5 minutes without speaking, using a magnifying glass to study every detail of the mother's face and posture. When she finally looked up, her expression was grave. "This woman had puerperal fever," Dr. Whitmore said quietly, "also known as childbed fever. Look here, at the modeling of her complexion, the sheen of perspiration on her forehead. See how her right facial muscles are slightly slack? That's early septic shock affecting the nervous system." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. It was the leading cause of maternal death in the 19th and early 20th centuries. An infection of the reproductive tract following childbirth, usually caused by unsanitary conditions during delivery. In 1902, the germ theory of disease was understood by scientists, but many doctors and midwives still didn't wash their hands properly. Dr. Whitmore set down the photograph gently. This woman would have known she was dying. The fever, the chills, the pain. She would have been experiencing all of it when this photograph was taken. Look at her knuckles, how tightly she's gripping the baby. Why would she do that? Dr. Whitmore's expression softened with sadness. Because she knew there would be no recovery. Puerperal fever was almost always fatal in that era. The antibiotics that could have saved her wouldn't be discovered for another 30 years. She wanted one thing before she died: a photograph with her child. Something that baby could have after she was gone. Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Is there any way to learn more about her?" "The name you found, Margaret O'Brien, it's common, but Worcester in 1902 was smaller than it is today." She paused, then added quietly, "I've studied hundreds of similar cases. Women who died in the prime of their lives, leaving behind children who would never know them. Their stories are almost always forgotten. If you can find Margaret's story, if you can tell it, you would be doing something important." Over the following weeks, Eleanor devoted herself to the search for Margaret O'Brien. She returned to the Worcester archives repeatedly, combing through birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and census data. The work was tedious, hours spent scrolling through microfilm and turning fragile pages. But slowly, the fragments of a life began to emerge. Margaret O'Brien was born Margaret Sullivan in 1877 in Worcester, Massachusetts, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had fled the famine a generation earlier. Her father worked in the wire mills that dominated the city's economy, and Margaret had grown up in the crowded tenements near the factories. At 19, she married Thomas O'Brien, a railroad worker 3 years her senior. By all accounts, it was a love match. The 1900 census showed them living in a small apartment on Winter Street, Thomas working on the railroad, Margaret keeping house. There were no children listed yet, but a note in a church record indicated that Margaret had suffered a miscarriage in 1899. Another in 1901. The birth certificate Eleanor found next told the next chapter. On April 14, 1902, Margaret gave birth to a daughter named Catherine Ann O'Brien. The delivery was attended by a Dr. William Hennessy. 3 days later, on April 17th, the photograph was taken, and on April 23, 1902, just 9 days after giving birth, Margaret O'Brien died. The death certificate listed the cause as puerperal septicemia. She was 25 years old. Eleanor found Margaret's obituary in the archives of the Worcester Evening Gazette. It was brief, only a few lines. O'Brien, Margaret, beloved wife of Thomas O'Brien, died April 23rd after a brief illness. She leaves behind a husband and infant daughter. Funeral services to be held at St. John's Church. A brief illness. Eleanor stared at those words, thinking of the woman in the photograph smiling through agony, holding her baby for what she must have known would be the last time. But the story didn't end there. Eleanor discovered that Thomas O'Brien had never remarried. He had raised Catherine alone, working double shifts on the railroad to pay for a nursemaid during her early years. The 1910 census showed them still living in Worcester, Thomas now listed as a foreman, 8-year-old Catherine attending school. Catherine O'Brien had grown up, married a man named Robert Price in 1923, and had 3 children of her own. Eleanor traced the family tree forward through decades, through wars and depressions and social upheavals, until she found a living descendant. Catherine O'Brien Price had died in 1987, but her granddaughter, also named Catherine, was still alive. Catherine Price, now 70 years old, lived in a small town in Connecticut. Eleanor found a phone number and, with trembling fingers, dialed. "Mrs. Price, my name is Eleanor Mitchell. I'm a photograph restorer in Boston. I recently came into possession of a photograph that I believe shows your great-grandmother, Margaret O'Brien, with her infant daughter." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a voice thick with emotion. "I've heard about that photograph my entire life. My grandmother spoke of it constantly when I was a child. She said it was the only picture ever taken of her mother and that it had been lost decades ago." 2 days later, Eleanor drove to Connecticut, the photograph carefully wrapped in acid-free tissue and nestled in a padded box on the passenger seat beside her. Catherine Price lived in a modest colonial house on a quiet street shaded by old maple trees. She was waiting on the front porch when Eleanor arrived, a tall woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold decades of waiting. Eleanor placed the photograph in her hands and watched as Catherine's expression crumbled. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, there she is. There's my grandmother, and that's Margaret." She traced the outline of Margaret's features with a trembling finger, tears running freely down her cheeks. "My grandmother told me about this photograph so many times. She said her mother was already sick when it was taken. The doctor had told her she probably wouldn't survive, that the infection was too advanced. But Margaret insisted. She made them carry her to the photography studio." Catherine led Eleanor inside to a sitting room filled with family photographs spanning multiple generations. She retrieved a worn wooden box from a shelf and set it on the coffee table. "These are things my grandmother kept." Inside the box were yellowed letters, a small leather diary, a religious medal, and a single pressed rose, its color long faded to brown. "Margaret knew she was dying," Catherine explained, lifting the letters carefully. "In her last days, she wrote letters to Catherine, to be given to her at different ages, on her 5th birthday, her 10th, her 16th, her wedding day." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "She wrote 11 letters in total. My grandmother saved every one of them." Catherine handed Eleanor one of the letters, its paper fragile with age. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone very ill, but the words were clear. "My dearest Catherine, I write this on your 5th birthday, a day I will not live to see. By now you have grown into a little girl, and I wish more than anything that I could see your face, hear your voice, hold you in my arms. But God has other plans for me. I want you to know that in the short time we had together, I loved you more than I ever knew it was possible to love. You were my miracle, my answered prayer. I waited so long to become a mother, suffered so much loss, and when you finally came, you were perfect. I held you in my arms and knew that everything I had endured was worth it. Please remember that you are never alone. I am always with you, in every breath you take, in every dream you have, in every moment of joy and sorrow. Be brave, my darling, be kind, and know that somewhere, somehow, your mother is watching over you, and she is so proud of the person you are becoming. Eleanor could not speak. She sat in Catherine's living room, holding a letter written by a dying woman to a daughter she would never see grow up, and she felt the full weight of Margaret O'Brien's love and loss. My grandmother read these letters at every milestone of her life, Catherine continued. She said they shaped who she became. She became a nurse, you know. She spent her whole career fighting for better conditions for mothers and babies, working in hospitals, advocating for sanitation and proper medical care. She said she did it for Margaret. She lifted another document from the box, a newspaper clipping from 1945. This is about my grandmother. She was recognized by the Massachusetts Medical Society for her work in maternal health. The article showed a photograph of Catherine O'Brien Price, now in her 40s, receiving an award. Eleanor looked at the face and saw echoes of Margaret, the same determined set of the jaw, the same fierce light in the eyes. Margaret never saw her daughter grow up, Catherine said quietly. But through those letters, through that photograph, she reached across death and shaped a life. My grandmother spent every day trying to make sure other children wouldn't lose their mothers the way she lost hers. Eleanor spent hours with Catherine learning the full story of Margaret O'Brien's life and legacy. Margaret had been just 15 when her own mother died, leaving her to help raise her younger siblings. She had delayed marriage until she was nearly 19, older than most women of her era, because she felt responsible for her family. When she finally married Thomas, she had desperately wanted children of her own, but 2 miscarriages had left her doubting whether she would ever become a mother. When she finally became pregnant with Catherine, she had been overjoyed. The pregnancy had been difficult, but she had carried the baby to term. The delivery itself had gone smoothly, but 3 days later, the fever had begun. Dr. Hennessy had tried everything available to him, but in 1902, there was nothing to be done for advanced puerperal sepsis. He had finally been honest with Margaret, telling her she likely had only days to live. Her response had been remarkable. Rather than give in to despair, Margaret had immediately begun planning. She had asked Thomas to take her to the photography studio, insisting that she needed a photograph with her daughter. She had begun writing the letters that would guide Catherine through her life. She had dictated instructions for Thomas about raising their daughter, about making sure Catherine knew she was loved, about never letting her forget that her mother had wanted her more than anything in the world. She was extraordinary, Catherine said. She faced death at 25 years old with a newborn baby and a husband who loved her, and instead of falling apart, she used every moment she had left to give Catherine something to hold on to. Those letters weren't just words. The story did not end with Margaret's death. Thomas O'Brien had honored every promise he made to his dying wife. He had raised Catherine with love and devotion, making sure she knew Margaret's story, reading her the letters at each appointed time. When Catherine was old enough, he had given her the photograph, the one image that existed of mother and daughter together. Catherine had treasured that photograph throughout her life, but sometime in the 1950s, during a family move, it had been lost. The frame, the image, everything had vanished. Catherine had searched for years, but had never found it. She died in 1987, still hoping it would turn up. Catherine's granddaughter said, "It broke her heart to lose it. That photograph was her most precious possession." She looked at Eleanor with tears in her eyes. "And now you've brought it back, 60 years after it was lost, 120 years after it was taken." Eleanor explained the estate sale, the box from Worcester, the research that had led her here. But even as she spoke, she felt that something larger than coincidence had been at work. The photograph had survived fires, moves, decades of neglect. It had made its way back to Margaret's descendants at just the right moment. Eleanor asked. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photograph in her hands. Then she spoke slowly, thoughtfully. "My grandmother spent her life making sure other mothers didn't suffer Margaret's fate. She wanted Margaret's story to matter, to change things. I think the best way to honor both of them would be to share this story." She met Eleanor's eyes. "Would you help me do that?" 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the atrium of the Worcester Historical Museum, watching visitors move through a small exhibition she and Catherine had created together. At the center was Margaret's photograph, now professionally restored and displayed in a climate-controlled case. Around it were the letters, the diary, documents from Catherine O'Brien Price's nursing career, and panels explaining the history of maternal mortality and the slow progress toward safer childbirth. Catherine stood beside Eleanor, watching a young mother pause before the photograph. The woman was perhaps 25, the same age Margaret had been, and she carried an infant in her arms. She read the caption beside the image, and Eleanor watched her expression shift from curiosity to understanding to something deeper. "She was so young," the woman murmured to her baby. An older couple stood nearby, reading Margaret's letter to her 5-year-old daughter. The woman wiped tears from her eyes. The man put his arm around her shoulder. A teenage girl approached Catherine hesitantly. "Margaret O'Brien was my great-great-grandmother," Catherine replied. "Wow," the girl said softly. "That's so sad, but also kind of beautiful." "That's exactly it," Catherine said. She used every moment she had left to love her daughter. As the museum began to close for the evening, Eleanor and Catherine stood alone before the photograph. The light was fading, casting long shadows across the exhibition space, but Margaret's face remained clear behind the glass. That strange, strained smile now seemed less mysterious and more heroic, the effort of a dying woman to project love and strength for her child. Eleanor asked quietly. Catherine considered the question for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I think she would. She wanted to be remembered. She wanted her daughter to know she existed. And now thousands of people will know. Mothers will look at her picture and hug their children a little tighter. Doctors will remember why sanitation matters." She touched the glass gently, her fingers tracing the outline of Margaret's face. "My grandmother used to say that love never really dies. It just changes form." Margaret's love became those letters. The letters became my grandmother's life work. Eleanor felt the truth of those words settle into her heart. She had started this journey trying to solve a mystery, to understand why a mother's smile seemed wrong. What she had found was something far more powerful than a historical puzzle. She had found a story of love that transcended death, of sacrifice that echoed through generations, of a woman who faced the end of her life with courage and used her final days to ensure her daughter would never feel unloved. As she took one last look at Margaret O'Brien's photograph, Eleanor no longer saw the strain in that smile. She saw strength. She saw determination. She saw a mother's fierce, unbreakable love, and Margaret's story, nearly lost to time, would now inspire generations to come.